Hey, it's Christopher again, and today's video covers animal attacks that are pure nightmare fuel. And the gut punch twist? At least one dog had a front row seat to every single one. From a tiny companion paddling helpless circles while a hippo finished the job on its owner, to a jaguar that ravaged a mechanic's walk as his mutt bolts into the bushes. But first, let's start with not just one, but 4 dogs who couldn't save a woman from being ripped apart by a deadly alligator. It was May 17, 2014, along the Cypress Edge Nature Trail in Collier County, Florida. You might call it routine. Her steps, her dogs, the same brackish edge. But routine is just luck that hasn't run out yet. Marla Sato was 52, widowed, and had walked her late husband's 4 rescue dogs along the swamp edge trail every afternoon for 3 years. Neighbors described her as quiet and punctual. Someone who nodded and kept moving. She knew the trail well enough to step over its cypress knees without looking down. The dogs, 3 mixed breed terriers and a heavier shepherd mix, were reactive near water. Marla had recently begun letting them range closer to the embankment as temperatures climbed. Her daughter said that her broader goal had nothing to do with the swamp. She was trying to rebuild enough routine to return to part-time work. The afternoon walks were part of that effort. Now, the county had received reported observations by kayakers of a large alligator in that section 6 weeks prior, logged after kayakers spotted it on a mud shelf roughly 40 yards from the embankment. However, no trapping was initiated. American alligators in Collier County regularly exceed 11 feet and 500 pounds. They are ambush predators, holding position beneath the surface for extended periods without producing a visible ripple and committing to a strike only when proximity makes it viable. A large adult generates bite pressure widely estimated in the several thousand-pound range and initiates a death roll almost immediately after securing its grip. That afternoon, a leash handle slipped when the shepherd mix lunged after a heron. A rubber toy drifted into the shallows. All 4 dogs clustered at the edge, stepping in and pulling back, whining. The partially obscured warning sign was visible, but not readable from where she stood. The toy was maybe 3 feet into mid-thigh deep, uneven shallows, transitioning toward waist depth a few steps farther in. She stepped off the bank. 80 yards away, a retiree named Hank was on his screened porch with iced tea, half watching the tree line. He heard the dogs change and looked up. He saw a woman appearing to stand in shallow water near the bank. He then noticed the dogs barking sharply and sudden splashing at the edge, looked away briefly, and when he looked back, there was violent thrashing in the water and the woman being pulled downward. She was in uneven water, ranging from mid-thigh to waist depth depending on footing, and reaching forward when the alligator erupted from just beneath the surface at the edge and clamped its jaws on her left thigh in a single motion. The force drove her sideways. Her upper Hank heard the heavy splash, then the dogs screaming. The water spread outward, and the vegetation along the bank moved slowly, deliberately, in a way that had nothing to do with wind. Hank called 911 and told the dispatcher he thought someone might have drowned. Maybe a gator. He wasn't certain. It happened fast. According to the investigation, the alligator death rolled shortly after the initial bite, causing spiral tearing of soft tissue and dragging Marla from mid-thigh water into deeper submerged channels within feet of the bank. She had no stable footing and no leverage. The shepherd mix briefly stepped into ankle-deep water and retreated. The alligator did not resurface visibly. Investigators later concluded the animal likely retreated through submerged channels along the root system away from the immediate bank area. Collier County Sheriff's deputies arrived approximately 18 minutes after Hank's call. Recovery divers were deployed that evening. Partial remains were recovered downstream the following morning. The 4 dogs were collected by animal control after refusing to leave the bank for hours. Hank gave a brief statement to a deputy. It's heartbreaking to think that Marla's quiet determination to rebuild her life, step by step, walk by walk, ended in such a sudden, senseless way. To me, the true sadness isn't just the loss itself, but the cruel irony that her small act of courage, reaching for a toy in shallow water, became the very moment everything was stolen from her and her dogs. Brutal, right? Well, this next one features a man who knew the risk, knew the territory, knew what lived there. He just thought he could beat the clock. It was September 23, 2015, on the western shore of Lake Malawi, near the village of Senga Bay, where fishermen pull their boats before the light goes flat, because what moves in the shallows after dark does not announce itself. Elias Moyo was 68, a retired primary school teacher who had spent 31 years educating children in Salima district before his pension returned him to village life full-time. He was known as a precise man, punctual, methodical, the type who kept a written ledger of his medicinal medicinal bark stores and the ailments they treated. His wife had been ill for 3 weeks with a joint condition the local clinic had been unable to adequately address, and a traditional healer across the lake had told him that bark from a specific tree along the far bank, dried and prepared correctly, could bring her relief. The healer wanted it within the week. Rain had already delayed Elias twice. He owned a narrow dugout canoe and had made the crossing dozens of times. His small mixed breed dog, a brown and white animal the village called Chuma, always rode in the bow when Elias went out. The dog was not a working animal. It simply would not stay behind. If I were to remove the gruesome parts of the story, picturing the dog in a canoe is actually cute. Unfortunately, this is not the right channel for that. The southern basin of Lake Malawi holds one of the highest concentrations of hippopotamuses in Central Africa. Adults average between 3,000 to 4,000 pounds and reach up to 13 feet in length. They are responsible for more human fatalities across Africa than any other large animal, and they are most aggressive in water, where they are territorial without exception. They surface quietly, just nostrils and eyes, and close distance faster than a paddled canoe. They become more active after dusk as they leave the water to graze on land. A fisherman named Dighton Fury, working a net from shore roughly 200 yards north of Elias's launch point, had seen hippo movement earlier that afternoon, a cow and a juvenile surfacing twice near mid-channel reed beds before submerging. He had been telling others not to cross until morning, but failed to warn Elias. Our victim paddled out. Elias was approximately 180 yards from the eastern bank when the canoe slowed. Dighton, still watching from shore, saw the water beside the hull rise before he heard anything. The hippo surfaced alongside the canoe and appeared alongside the hull, surfacing and driving upward with its bulk, rammed upward, then bit into the hull, overturning the canoe. The canoe went sideways immediately, throwing Elias left and Chuma forward into the water. Dighton described the sound of splintering wood reaching shore a full second after the impact. Elias hit the water and the hippo repositioned within seconds, driving into him from below. Dighton saw the water churn and then only a widening churn and sediment plume, not a clear color change at that distance. Elias did not surface after the second contact. The canoe split into 2 sections. Chuma was in the water, paddling tight circles through the debris, barking at the surface. Dighton and 2 other fishermen pushed a rescue boat out within minutes, reaching the debris in roughly 8 minutes. They recovered both halves of the canoe, Elias's sandal and his bark-collecting sack. Chuma was found paddling toward the reeds and was pulled from the water. Elias was never recovered. There was no formal coroner's report, no body, no examination. Village records noted the incident as a disappearance at water. Cause of death: presumed fatal trauma and drowning following hippopotamus strike. Understood by everyone present. 3 days later, his wife, still unwell, was brought to the lakeside on a chair by her children. The elders conducted a quiet ritual at the water's edge, placing reeds and maize flour on the surface. She did not speak throughout. Can you imagine him? A man who had navigated this lake his entire life, yet still made the crossing at the worst possible hour, for the most human of reasons. That gap between what I know and what love made him do is exactly where these incidents live. Our next victim had people around him all night. He had dogs with him on the walk home, and none of it mattered. It was October 6, 2015, near Mwanga village in Tanzania's Kilimanjaro region. Joram Ndele chose to walk the shortcut through chest-high grass. Do you want to know what a person's last unguarded moment feels like before the world turns into impact and teeth? Joram Ndele was 39, a construction laborer who had spent nearly 2 decades hauling rebar and mixing concrete across sites in the Kilimanjaro region. He was known on every crew he worked for as dependable and physically strong, the kind of man site supervisors called first when a problem required stubbornness more than skill. He had a wife, 2 daughters, and a son in secondary school, whose fees he had been covering by taking double shifts through the dry season. He had attended a wedding celebration in the neighboring settlement of Kasanga, roughly 2 miles east along the main road. By most accounts from other attendees, Joram had been drinking steadily through the evening and left well after midnight, alone. 2 stray dogs that commonly circulated between Mwanga and Kasanga fell in loosely behind him. I haven't been to Tanzania, but I've been to Southeast Asia, and some stray dogs there are just like that. He stopped to rest at least once against a concrete boundary post and was heard singing intermittently. When he reached the junction where the paved road curved northwest toward Mwanga, he cut southeast into the scrubland instead, likely because the shortcut shaved roughly a quarter mile off the walk. However, what makes this shortcut dangerous is its position, directly adjacent to a corridor used seasonally by wildlife, moving between two unfenced conservation buffer zones. African lions in that broader regional system are more consistently documented in nearby ecosystems, and individuals in this fringe area are typically dispersing or moving through conflict corridors between protected zones. In such conditions, they are often solitary or moving in small groups of 1 to 2 rather than stable prides. Adults weigh between 265 and 420 pounds. They typically remain mostly silent during a hunt, though brief low vocalizations can occur between individuals at close range. A motorbike rider traveling the main road that night noticed movement in the tall grass to his right, uneven disturbances moving through the grass, and then heard the two dogs bark, then quickly escalate into frantic barking before abruptly stopping. He slowed. The grass was still. Joram was no longer visible on the path. Now, from what investigators can reconstruct, the attack likely began within a close-range window of roughly 30 to 70 feet. There was no time to react, and Joram was knocked down on first contact. The dogs briefly split away while barking before fleeing. A motorbike rider saw grass compress and shift away from the road in a short, irregular movement, then immediately went for help. Villagers arrived about 20 minutes later with torches and metal rods. Any dragging into the brush was likely brief and disrupted by the approaching group, leaving an inconsistent path from the point of contact. The remains showed severe trauma consistent with a large felid attack, including deep neck and upper back lacerations, fractured ribs, and crush injuries to the skull. Death was attributed to traumatic injury. Personally, the saddest part about this is the people he left behind. His wife received the news before dawn from a neighbor who had been among the search party. The children finished the term with help from extended family, and the son stayed in school, though double shifts became single shifts for everyone left behind. The two dogs returned to the village by morning. It was an ordinary death in a place where lions and people share shrinking ground. Just a man taking a shortcut, just a family learning to live without him. You could argue Joram put himself in the wrong place. But this next one, she was 16, walking the same river path she walked every single day, in broad daylight, doing everything right. It was August 28, 2015, and the river path outside Salmara village in Assam's Chirang district had already begun to soften under the early fog when a 16-year-old girl set down her water container, checked her phone, and never picked either one up again. Lila Bora was a class 11 student at a government school approximately 2 miles from her home, a distance she covered on foot 6 days a week without incident or complaint. She was the second of 4 children in a farming household, known among her teachers for consistent attendance and among neighbors for quiet reliability. She had taken the river path since she was 11, first with her older brother, then alone, then occasionally with the family's tan-coated Stray, a medium-sized dog that followed her on mornings when it felt like it. The path ran along the Manus River fringe, skirting the outer edge of the reserve forest. She had paused approximately 440 yards from the tree line, in a section where the trail narrowed between a sandbar and a dense wall of bamboo. A passerby last saw her balancing the water container on one hip and looking at her phone. The dog had settled into a patch of shade off the trail. Forest Patrol records from the Chirang Ripu division show that a tiger had been reported near the Salmara fringe 3 times in the preceding 6 weeks. Once by a cattle herder whose cow sustained a partial bite wound. Once by a group of farmers who spotted pug marks crossing a paddy field at dawn. And once by a school teacher who reported seeing a large animal cross the path. Warning notices had been posted at the edge of the village and distributed through the local panchayat office. Whether Lila had seen them is not established. The Bengal tiger is among the largest terrestrial predators alive, with adult males in the Manus corridor reaching over 450 pounds and measuring close to 10 feet from nose to tail. They are ambush hunters, capable of bursts exceeding 35 miles per hour over short distances, and they rely on concealment rather than pursuit, positioning themselves within striking range before any movement is detected. A tiger at close range generates no warning sound before the lunge. The attack sequence, from emergence to contact, can be completed in under 2 seconds. A farmer named Hemanta, approximately 65 yards away, was splitting firewood when he heard it. A sudden, dense thud. Not a cracking branch, not a stumble, followed by a single, short sound that stopped as quickly as it began, followed by a brief dog bark, cut off mid-call, an abrupt movement in the bamboo line. He looked up. The bamboo on the far side of the trail was shaking in one concentrated section. A flash of orange and black striping disappeared into thicker growth. Now, before you get frustrated on what happens next, you have to understand that he did not see Lila. He did not immediately understand what he had witnessed. He called out twice, not really having a sense of urgency. He received no answer, and after roughly a minute, walked over. He found her phone face down in the dirt, the water container crushed flat on one side, and a drag mark pressed into the soft soil, leading into the brush. The dog was gone. There was minimal visible blood obscured by disturbed soil and leaf litter at the point of first contact, just disturbed ground and a set of enormous paw impressions in the mud. Forest Patrol arrived after Hamanta flagged down a passing vehicle and reported the scene. Officers followed the drag mark and scattered fragments of clothing for nearly 220 yards into Sal Forest before locating the remains beneath a fallen log, partial, fed upon, and cached. The tiger had returned to cover the kill. The recovery team withdrew and waited until the following morning to retrieve the body due to visibility and the risk of the animal still being in proximity. Time of death was estimated to be within minutes of initial contact. No evidence of prolonged struggle. What haunts me most is not the tiger's nature. It acted on instinct, but the ordinary silence of that morning, broken by a sound no one understood in time. And the dog, never recovered, perhaps still waiting somewhere in the bamboo, traumatized beyond words. Meanwhile, our next dog had no choice but to stay, and I think that detail makes it harder to read. It was October 7, 2013, at a remote field survey camp on the eastern fringe of the Okavango Delta, Botswana. A sick man's world has shrunk to the inside of a dome tent, and outside, a clan of spotted hyenas has learned that unusual stillness often means easy prey. Imagine being the one who decided to leave him there. Robert Foree, 44, an experienced field survey assistant, was sidelined by a gastrointestinal illness 3 days into an assignment, left incapacitated in his tent while his team worked within radio range. His dog, Kip, was tied outside, enough rope to lie down, not to reach the flap, a setup used before without incident. That morning, camp cook Neo Dube told a researcher he had heard hyena calls from the drainage channel 300 meters north on both previous nights. No precaution was taken beyond securing food stores in the supply tent. Robert, feverish, was not part of that conversation. Spotted hyenas live in clans of up to 80 individuals and take most of their diet through active hunting. Adults weigh 90 to 190 pounds, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crack large bovine bone cleanly. The site briefing document, reviewed before departure, had noted that a clan of roughly 12 spotted hyenas made 2 confirmed approach attempts at a geology team's camp 3 miles away in the preceding month. That information had been logged and filed, and no escalation of deterrent measures was implemented beyond standard camp layout procedures. Neo woke sometime after 10 p.m. to Kip in full alarm. Not intermittent barking, but a sustained, unbroken eruption. He unzipped his tent flap a few inches. In the dim ambient light, 3 or 4 heavy shapes moved in the slow, rocking gait of hyenas circling Robert's dome tent. One animal peeled off toward the dog. Kip lunged to the rope's full extension, snapping hard, then backed against the stake. The hyena circled. The barking broke into a high, continuous yelp, then a low whimper, and Kip pressed flat to the ground and kept straining against the rope, fraying it with its own teeth. The hyena turned and went back to the tent. The dog did not stop pulling. The tent fabric began to fail, first at a lower seam where pressure was repeatedly applied, with intermittent biting and probing rather than sustained tearing, opening the material in ragged strips over time. A second animal worked an adjacent panel in short bursts, testing tension points rather than collapsing it in a single effort. The dome's internal frame buckled inward as cumulative stress spread across multiple points of contact. Neo had woken the other 2 team members by then and was banging a cooking pot against a metal crate from his tent entrance, yelling. The hyenas did not retreat. Robert's arms came up against whatever forced through the widening gap. The injuries documented afterward were consistent with repeated bites to both forearms, the left hand nearly degloved at the wrist, and deep lacerations across the face and anterior neck. Hyena bite force applied to the neck in close-range feeding or defensive contexts is capable of causing severe crushing trauma and rupture of major cervical blood vessels rather than clean separation. The cervical injuries were the ones that ended it. Neo placed the emergency call within minutes of waking the others. The nearest response unit was over 3 hours away by road. By the time the vehicle arrived with headlights, the hyenas had already moved off toward the drainage channel. It was too late for Robert. Death was attributed to acute blood loss from traumatic injuries consistent with large carnivore attacks. A colleague adopted Kip before camp, relocated 3 days later. I can't imagine being sick and helpless while animals tear you apart. It must have felt like your own body finally becoming the fever, a thing that burns and breaks from the inside, no longer yours, not even screaming fast enough to keep up with the jaws. But sometimes, the danger doesn't come from leaving a sick man behind. It comes from what you deliberately tune out ahead of you. It was June 14, 2018, on Trail Ridge in the Flathead National Forest, Montana, and by the time anyone understood what had happened, the man who could explain it was already on the ground. Ari Kurson was 33, a software developer from Missoula who ran ultramarathons the way other people kept spreadsheets, obsessively and alone. He had logged nearly 1,200 trail miles the previous year, documented in a running journal his co-workers described as almost clinical in its detail. He had been training for a 50-mile race in September and identified Trail Ridge as ideal for elevation work, remote enough to simulate race day isolation. He brought his dog, a large husky mix. His habit of running with headphones was well known. A fellow Missoula runner, Dane Okafor, running a parallel descent trail roughly 400 yards lower on the ridge that morning, would later tell authorities he had recognized Kurson from a distance. The dog out front, the white wire of earbuds faintly visible even at that distance. Trail Ridge sits in a corridor of mixed conifer and open meadow that grades into dense brush near seasonal creek drainages, exactly the terrain where grizzly bears in the northern Rockies concentrate in early summer. Grizzly sows with cubs in that region average between 250 and 350 pounds and can accelerate to 35 miles per hour within seconds. A charge from concealed brush at 20 feet or less leaves a human being with no viable response, regardless of preparation. The previous evening, a ranger station at the Hungry Horse Reservoir had posted a bear advisory. A sow with 2 cubs had been documented 3 times in the past week within a mile of the trailhead. The advisory recommended traveling in groups, carrying bear spray, and avoiding headphones. Kurson had passed the trailhead signage at approximately 6:40 a.m. He was carrying no bear spray. Okafor noted that the dog had been ranging 30 to 40 yards ahead for most of the section he could observe, consistent with how the encounter likely developed. The sow came out of brush, flanking the trail at a creek drainage, estimated at roughly 18 feet of distance. Okafor, watching from the lower trail, saw Kurson stumbled backward immediately on contact. The dog barked once, a single sharp burst, then moved uphill and away from the trail at speed, where it continued barking. The initial strike was to the left shoulder and upper back, hard enough that Okafor observed Kurson's body jolt and collapse from his position. Kurson went face down into the trail surface. The sow drove her jaws into the back of his neck and upper skull. Kurson's body shifted with each bite, but showed no organized movement after the first few seconds. She bit again into the right shoulder, tearing through the muscle to the bone. The force was enough to rotate his upper body several inches along the trail. There was no vocalization that Okafor could identify as words. The sounds he described to investigators were involuntary, not screaming, just pressure leaving a body. The cubs did not come onto the trail at any point and were not visually confirmed during the incident, with their presence only inferred from prior ranger reports and track evidence in the area. The sow stood over him briefly, then moved back into the brush. Okafor reached the scene approximately minutes after the attack. Now, if that was me, I would at least call emergency first before putting myself in the scene. Kurson was face down, not moving. Okafor triggered the SOS function on Kurson's GPS watch, which had rolled to the trail edge. A rescue team arrived via helicopter to a clearing 600 feet downhill in 22 minutes. He was pronounced dead on scene. The dog was recovered near the trailhead later that afternoon, caught on a hunter's trail camera pacing and barking from roughly 80 yards from where the attack occurred. He was uninjured. The area was temporarily closed following the incident. The headphones are the detail that stays with me, not as a singular cause, but as a deliberate choice to remove the one early warning system that required nothing extra to carry. And if you think a pair of earbuds is a small thing to die for, wait until you hear about the man who died because a routine wildlife sighting sat in a logbook for 2 days. It was July 19, 2015, on the western bank of the Juruá River in Amazonas State, Brazil. What Pedro didn't know was that the seasonal low water didn't just just reveal mud. It erased the only thing that had been keeping him safe. Pedro Henrique Lima was 47 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life underneath boat engines. He worked freelance out of a small cooperative dock near the town of Erunepe, a position that paid inconsistently but kept him outdoors and self-directed. He had 2 daughters in secondary school in Manaus and sent money home on an irregular but reliable schedule. That afternoon, he had motored 12 miles downstream to inspect a cargo boat whose operator had reported a seized cooling impeller. The job was straightforward, the kind Pedro could handle alone in 2 hours. He had brought his dog, a small mixed-breed dockyard mutt named Kaju, who had ridden in the bow of his skiff for 3 years without instruction. Now, according to what I've read based on statements, Pedro taking the dog on solo runs was a habit more than anything else. Though Kaju was typically calm and stayed close rather than ranging into dense brush, Kaju began acting restless approximately 20 minutes into the repair. The dog moved away from the waterline, circled the rear of the skiff twice, and posted itself near the edge of the mud shelf facing the tree line, ears forward and body low, but it did not fully leave Pedro's immediate area. Pedro continued working. The root tangle behind the boat was dense enough to block sightlines past a few feet into the interior vegetation. Suddenly, a jaguar came out of the root system from behind and to Pedro's left while he was crouched over the engine housing. Adult jaguars in western Amazonas are among the largest in South America, with males regularly exceeding 250 pounds and measuring over 6 feet from nose to tail base. They do not pursue. They wait inside cover and target the back of the skull with a bite capable of generating over 1,500 pounds per square inch of force, the strongest of any big cat relative to body size. There was no vocalization. A boat operator anchored roughly 80 feet upstream reported a movement along the bank. Kaju barked once at close range and rushed toward the movement before breaking off and retreating back toward the skiff. The operator shouted, but Pedro had already gone down. Now, apparently, the jaguar took him by the back of the skull. The impact drove his face into the engine casing. He must have went limp within seconds. The animal dragged him laterally off the transom platform and into the root cluster in a single continuous pull, his boots leaving 2 parallel furrows in the mud before disappearing into the tangle. The drag marks showed no meaningful resistance after the first few feet. The boat operator was still shouting when the tree line closed behind both of them. He radioed the upstream station immediately. A patrol boat arrived 35 minutes later with 2 officers and a search team. They entered the root system on foot and recovered Pedro's tool bag, 1 sandal, and a section of his work shirt near the waterline. His body was never recovered. Kaju reappeared 4 days later at a downstream dock village, thin and visibly displaced, and was taken in by a local family. His daughters received the news in Manaus and were left to mourn a father who had vanished into the forest without a trace, holding no grave to visit and no closure to hold on to. I think grieving without a body means the mind never stops searching. Every shadow on the water, every rustle in the brush becomes a false promise of an ending that will never come.